You're a footnote to a better woman. What my godmother learned the next morning about who owns my mother's name. The champagne flute cracked against the marble the same second Cordelia said it, and I remember thinking the sound and the sentence arrived together, like they'd been rehearsed. "Margot, sweetheart," she said, loud enough for the third row of little gold chairs to hear. "You have to understand. You're a footnote to a better woman. Nobody buys a dress because of a footnote." The runway lights were that surgical white that makes everyone look embalmed, and the room smelled of gardenia and hot bulbs and money. Behind her, 40 feet of screen played my mother's face on a loop, her signature stitched under it in a font my mother never chose. 200 people applauded my mother and looked at me like I was the caterer. I did not correct her. I let her have the microphone, the screen, the applause, all of it. What Cordelia did not know, what none of them in that room knew, was which of us actually owned the name printed on every label they were clapping for. I want to tell this the way it happened, from the beginning, so you understand it wasn't luck, it was patience. I grew up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, over a dry cleaner's on Main Street, in 3 rooms that always smelled faintly of steam and dye. My mother, Vivian Sinclair, was a seamstress before she was ever a designer, a real one, the kind who could take a $9 remnant of Dupioni silk and make a bride weep. She worked out of the back of that dry cleaner for a man named Mr. Petrakis, hemming other people's clothes for $6 an hour, and at night she designed. She kept her sketches in a $2 spiral notebook, and she wore a silver charm bracelet with 3 charms, a thimble, a tiny pair of scissors, and a little house that her own mother had given her in 1971. When she leaned over the machine, the bracelet clicked against the metal table, click, 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 a sound I could pick out of any noise on earth. We had nothing. I want to be honest about that. There were winters we heated 1 room and slept in it, all 3 of us, me, my mother, and my cousin Solène, whose parents had died in a wreck on I-95 when she was 9, and who my mother took in without a second's hesitation. "Family isn't a favor," she'd say. "It's just what we are." Solène and I shared a mattress until we were 14. We are closer than sisters. Remember her. She matters. Cordelia came into our lives in 1994, and I won't lie about the good years, because they were good. She was my mother's friend from the garment district in New York, glossy, connected, loud in the way that fills a room and makes you feel chosen when the spotlight of her attention swings to you. She had money, or the appearance of it, which in fashion is nearly the same currency. She agreed to be my godmother the year I turned 6, and for a while she was wonderful. She brought me a coat from Paris. She told my mother, "Vivian, your work belongs on 5th Avenue, not in a strip mall in Pawtucket." And she meant it, then. I believe she meant it then. Here is the seed of everything, so plant it now and watch it grow. In 2003, when I was 15, my mother had a partnership drawn up, not with Cordelia, with a lawyer named Brendan Ashcroft, a young estate attorney from Providence who did the paperwork for Mr. Petrakis' shop and liked my mother's honesty. My mother didn't trust handshakes. She'd been burned in the garment trade by 3 of them, so she registered her own trademark, the name Vivian Sinclair, the signature, the little house-shaped logo, as her personal property, held not by any company but by her, individually, as a natural person. Brendan set it up so the name and her likeness could never be sold off in a bankruptcy, never seized by a partner, never touched by anyone but her heir. "The name outlives the business, Viv," he told her. "Whoever holds the name holds the whole thing." My mother nodded and clicked her bracelet on the edge of his desk and signed. I was in that room. I was 15 and bored, and I remember Brendan's stuck-bottom desk drawer that he had to lift and yank to open, and I remember thinking, none of it mattered. It mattered more than anything else in my life. My mother's label got its real start in 2006. A boutique on Thayer Street ordered 12 dresses. Then a buyer from Boston ordered 40. By 2009, she had a proper atelier, 1,400 square feet on Westminster Street, 8 sewing machines, 4 employees, and the name Vivian Sinclair meant something in New England. Cordelia became her business partner that year, put in $180,000 for a 40% stake in the operating company, Maison Sinclair LLC. 40% of the company, not 1% of the name. That distinction is the whole story, and nobody remembered it but me, Solène, and Brendan. My mother got sick in the spring of 2015, pancreatic. It moved fast, 11 weeks from the first scan to the last morning. She spent a lot of those weeks teaching me things I thought I already knew. How to cut a bias so it falls like water. How to read a person's shoulders before you measure them. And one afternoon, near the end, with the radio left on low playing a station neither of us liked, she took the silver bracelet off her own wrist and worked the clasp onto mine. The charms were worn thin by then, the little scissors nearly smooth, the thimble a soft silver blur, the house a shape you had to know to recognize. "You're the whole thing now, Margot," she said, "not the company, the name. It's yours the day I'm gone. Brendan has the papers. Don't let anyone tell you what you are." She died on June 2nd, 2015. I was 27. And this is where the slow erosion started, so quietly I almost talked myself out of noticing. The first wrong note came at the funeral. Cordelia stood at the front of the church in Providence and gave a eulogy that was really an advertisement. She talked about the vision we built together and carrying the torch forward, and I watched Solène's jaw tighten in the pew beside me. Afterward, in the receiving line, Cordelia squeezed my hands and said, "Don't you worry about the business, darling. I'll handle everything. You just grieve." I was grieving. I let her handle it. That was the first mistake, and I made it on purpose to see what she'd do with the rope. The second note came in September 2015. Maison Sinclair LLC, per its operating agreement, passed my mother's 60% to me. I was her sole heir, her only child, and the will was airtight. That gave me controlling interest in the company on paper, but Cordelia had spent the summer moving. She'd gotten 2 of the 4 employees to sign loyalty to a new creative direction. She'd called an emergency member meeting while I was still sleeping through the afternoons, the way grief makes you do. And she and her 40% and a proxy she'd sweet-talked out of my mother's old bookkeeper voted to install herself as managing creative director, with sole authority over design and branding. It was sloppy and probably challengeable, but I was 27 and drowning, and she was 58 and had lawyers. She counted on my grief. She budgeted for it. The third note, October 2015. I drove to the atelier on Westminster and my key didn't turn. New lock. There was a sticky note on the glass in Cordelia's handwriting. "Margot, call first next time. We're in production," with a little heart. I stood on the sidewalk under a streetlight that buzzed and flickered, holding my dead mother's keys, and I twisted the bracelet around my wrist 3 times, and I did not cry. I cataloged. That is a thing I do. I put it in the file. By 2016, she was moving faster than I could believe. She rebranded. She spent, I later learned from the discovery documents, $340,000 on a relaunch. New label design, new campaign, a showroom in New York. She kept the name Vivian Sinclair on everything because, of course she did. That name was the only asset that couldn't be manufactured. She just rearranged the story around it. In the press, she became the co-founder and design heir. She gave an interview to a trade magazine in which she described my mother as my muse and protégé, reversing it, making Vivian the student. She described me, when asked, as Vivian's daughter, a lovely girl, not in the business. Not in the business. My mother's blood and I was a lovely girl. I want you to understand I wasn't sitting still and weeping. Here's the thing Cordelia never grasped, because she only ever saw me at 15 and at 27, and never once looked at the years between. I had built something myself, quietly. After my mother died, I couldn't bear the atelier, so I'd gone the other direction, into the paper, the boring stuff, the part of fashion nobody photographs. I took a job in 2016 with a licensing firm in Boston, Harlow and Reeve, that managed intellectual property for estates, names, likenesses, image rights for musicians and designers, and one very famous dead chef. I started as a coordinator making $52,000. By 2019, I was managing a portfolio worth $30 million in licensing rights. I learned the machinery of exactly one thing: how a dead person's name is owned, protected, licensed, and defended. I learned it because it was the last thing my mother handed me, and I wanted to understand what I was holding. I did not tell Cordelia any of this. Why would I? She never asked what I did. She thought I was a lovely girl, not in the business. I was, by 2020, one of the country's specialists in exactly the kind of asset she was standing on top of. I kept the bracelet on my wrist every day at Harlow and Reeve. Clients would be signing seven-figure deals to license a dead icon's face onto a perfume bottle, and I'd be taking notes with 3 worn-thin charms clicking against the conference table. Click, click, click. And nobody knew that sound was my mother teaching me from the ground. So Len stayed close through all of it. She'd become a paralegal. Funny how the 2 orphaned girls both ran toward paperwork like it was solid ground. And she worked, as it happened, for Brendan Ashcroft, who still practiced estate law in Providence, older now, still with that stuck desk drawer he never fixed. It was Solène who called me in January 2023 with the thing that turned the whole machine over. "Margot," she said, "are you sitting down?" Cordelia filed to trademark Vivian Sinclair as a brand name, federal registration. She's trying to move the name into the LLC's assets. She's trying to make the company own it. I sat very still. The radio was on in my kitchen. I'd left it running that morning, a habit I got from my mother, and it kept playing while my whole chest went quiet and cold and clear. Because here was the thing. Cordelia had spent 8 years building a fashion label entirely on my mother's name. The dresses, the campaigns, the $340,000 relaunch, the New York showroom, the interviews, the gala she was already planning, all of it rested on 4 syllables: Vivian Sinclair. And she had just, in writing in a federal filing, admitted that she did not own those 4 syllables, that she needed to acquire them, that the foundation under her entire 8-year empire belonged to someone else. It belonged to me. It had belonged to me since June 2nd, 2015. My mother, in 2003, in a room with a stuck drawer, had made the name her personal property, inheritable only by her heir, unreachable by any partner or company. Cordelia owned 40% of a company. I owned the word the company was named after. I owned my mother's face. Every image, every likeness, the signature, the little house-shaped logo. I owned the ground she'd built her tower on, and she'd just filed a public document proving she knew the ground wasn't hers. That was the click, not tears, a latch closing somewhere behind my sternum. I called Brendan Ashcroft the next morning at 9 a.m. He answered on the second ring. "Margot Sinclair," he said, warm. "I wondered how long it would take you." "Tell me what I have," I said. "You have everything," he said. "You've always had everything. Your mother made sure. Come to Providence. Bring the bracelet. The courts like a good story, and juries like a better one. But honestly, Margot, this won't see a jury. She has nothing to stand on." I did not want to move fast and sloppy the way Cordelia had in 2015. I'd watched her do it. I knew how a rushed strike leaves you exposed. So I spent 9 months being patient, because patience is the only inheritance that never runs out. Here is what patience looked like. Brendan pulled the original 2003 trademark registration, the personal property assignment, my mother's signature notarized on both. Solène pulled the full corporate history of Maison Sinclair LLC, every filing, every vote, including the sloppy 2015 meeting that installed Cordelia. We built a clean chain. My mother owned the name personally, I inherited it personally, and at no point had it ever been transferred to the company. The LLC had been using the name for 8 years under an implied license that had never been written down and had never, not once, paid me $1 for it. Do you understand what that is? For 8 years, Maison Sinclair had built a business on a name it did not own and had no license to use. Every dress sold since June 2015 was, technically, infringement. Every campaign. The whole $340,000 relaunch. All of it borrowed against an asset that belonged to a lovely girl, not in the business. We had Brendan quietly calculate the exposure, 8 years of revenue under the mark. Even at a conservative royalty rate of 8%, standard in the industry, I knew because I set those rates for a living at Harlow & Reeve, the back-owed licensing fees came to just over $1.4 million. That was before we even discussed damages for the willful, knowing infringement her January 2023 filing proved. I did not sue. Not yet. That was the discipline. A lawsuit is a threat you spend before you fire it, and I wanted something better than a settlement. I wanted the room. I wanted the exact room she'd been building for 8 years to become the room where she learned what she'd built it on. And Cordelia handed me the room herself. In the spring of 2024, she announced her masterpiece, Vivienne Sinclair, a retrospective, a black tie gala at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum in Providence, June 14, 2025, 10 years and 12 days after my mother died. 200 guests, buyers from Bergdorf and Saks, 3 trade journalists, a retrospective of my mother's life's work, curated and narrated by Cordelia, positioning herself forever as the keeper of the flame. Tickets were $500 a plate. The whole event was designed to cement, publicly and permanently, that Vivienne Sinclair the brand belonged to Cordelia. She sent me an invitation, a real one, thick cream cardstock, letterpress. There was a handwritten line at the bottom, "Margot, do come. Your mother would want family there." See, family. She'd used my mother's own word against me, the way she used everything. I RSVP'd yes. Of course I did. Here's the part where I tell you the system looked like it was on her side. Because it did, right up until it wasn't. When Solène and I first went to Brendan and laid it all out, his junior associate, a sharp, nervous kid named Theo Vance, actually argued against us. "She's been operating openly for 8 years, he said. "There's a doctrine called latches. If you sleep on your rights too long, you can lose them. A court might say Margot waited too long, acquiesced, let Cordelia build in good faith." For about an hour that afternoon, the law itself seemed to be Cordelia's ally, the way the family had been in 2015, the way everyone always sided with the loud, glossy woman over the quiet girl. Then Brendan lifted his stuck drawer, yanked it open, and put the January 2023 federal filing on the desk. "Good faith," he said, tapping it. "You can't claim good faith and file to acquire the very thing you're pretending you already own. This document is her confession. She knew. It's in her own hand, submitted to the federal government under penalty of perjury. There's no latches here. There's just theft with a paper trail." Theo went quiet. The system straightened up and remembered whose side the truth was on. I spent the year before the gala being merciful in the only way I understand mercy, which is to give someone every chance to stop before you let them finish. In November 2024, I had Brendan send Cordelia a single, quiet letter. No threat, no dollar figure. Just a formal notice that the Vivienne Sinclair name and likeness were held personally by Margot Sinclair, sole heir, and that any use required a license. A soft knock on the door. She never answered it. Her lawyer, a Providence firm charging her, I'd bet, $650 an hour, sent back 3 lines dismissing it as meritless and an obvious attempt by an estranged relative to extract money from a business she has no part in. She didn't even read it seriously. She was so certain of what I was. A footnote. A lovely girl, not in the business. She budgeted for my grief in 2015, and she budgeted for my weakness in 2024, and both times she was spending money that wasn't hers. So I stopped knocking. By June of 2025, everything was staged. Brendan had the full infringement complaint drafted and ready to file. $1.4 million in back royalties, treble damages for willful infringement, bringing the exposure north of $4 million, plus an injunction that would legally bar Maisel Sinclair from ever using the name Vivian Sinclair again. An injunction, meaning the day I chose, the brand could be forced to peel that name off every label, every door, every campaign, and become a company selling anonymous dresses, a fashion house forbidden from speaking its own name. I also, quietly, did one more thing. Through a holding entity Brendan set up, I'd learned that trick at Harlow and Reeve, I bought out the 2 minority members of Maisel Sinclair, LLC, my mother's old bookkeeper's proxy stake, and one of the loyal employees who, it turned out, hadn't been paid a fair wage in years and was happy to take $60,000 for a slice of a company she'd stopped believing in. Small stakes, 6% combined. But added to my inherited 60%, it meant that on the morning of June 15, 2025, I would control 66% of the very company Cordelia thought she ran. She'd have her 40%. No, she'd have her 34% because math had happened while she wasn't looking. She had 34% of a company, and I had 66% of that same company, plus the name it couldn't exist without. I told no one but Solène and Brendan. I wore black to the gala, and I wore the bracelet. The retrospective was everything Cordelia dreamed. The RISD Museum's Great Hall, 40-foot screens, my mother's designs on dress forms lit like relics, gardenias in every corner, a string quartet. 200 people in black tie eating $500 salmon. Cordelia in silver Valentino, glowing, holding court. And on every wall, every program, every step and repeat where the journalists shot photos, the name, Vivienne Sinclair, in that font my mother never chose. I sat in the 3rd row of little gold chairs next to Solène, and I let Cordelia give her speech. I let her get all the way to the end of it. I let her say the thing about the footnote. She saw me in the crowd, and something small and cruel in her couldn't resist, and she said into the live microphone in front of 200 people and 3 journalists, "Margot, sweetheart, you have to understand. You're a footnote to a better woman. Nobody buys a dress because of a footnote." The champagne flute of the man next to me slipped and cracked on the marble. Everyone laughed, gently, at me. I did not correct her. I waited until the next morning. That was the discipline my mother left me, and Cordelia never learned. The difference between the strike that feels good and the strike that ends it. I could have stood up in that gold chair and shouted the truth, and been the crazy relative making a scene at a beautiful party, and every one of those 200 people would have remembered me exactly as Cordelia painted me. So I smiled, and I left early, and I let her have her perfect night. I let her sleep well. It was the last good sleep her empire ever got. At 9 a.m. on June 15, 2025, Brendan Ashcroft filed the complaint in U.S. District Court in Providence. At 9:15, a courier hand-delivered a bound copy to Cordelia's suite at the Providence Biltmore, where she was hosting a morning-after brunch for the buyers from Bergdorf and Saks, the very people she needed to place fall orders. She'd staged that, too. She'd staged everything except the one thing she never controlled. So Len was there, I'd made sure of it, as my family representative, invited by Cordelia herself. So Len called me and held the phone up so I could hear. I heard the courier. I heard the paper. I heard the buyer's polite murmurings stop. And then I walked in. I'd been in the lobby the whole time in the same black dress with the bracelet on my wrist. Cordelia was standing by the window with the complaint in her hands, and the light coming in behind her was that thin gray Providence morning light, and her face. I will remember her face until I die. Her face was the color of the paper she was holding. She looked up and saw me, and she did not understand yet, so I told her plainly, the way you're supposed to tell the truth, in one clean sentence. You built an 8-year business on a name you don't own, I said. I own it. I've always owned it. My mother made the name her personal property in 2003, and I inherited it, all of it. The name Vivian Sinclair, her signature, her face, her likeness, every image on every wall you rented last night, the day she died. Not the company, the name. And the company can't sell a single dress without it. The room was silent. One of the buyers, a woman from Bergdorf named Priya, set down her fork with a small, clear sound. Cordelia's hands were shaking. This is... Margot, this is a misunderstanding. This is... She turned to the buyers, trying to find the microphone she always had and realizing there wasn't one. This is a family matter, please. It's not a family matter, Brendan said, stepping in behind me, calm, 64 years old and enjoying himself. It's a federal one. Ms. Sinclair, Margot, holds the registered mark. In January 2023, Cordelia, you filed to acquire that mark, which means you've admitted under penalty of perjury that you knew you didn't hold it. That filing is Exhibit C. There's no good faith defense. There's a $1.4 million royalty claim, treble damages for willful infringement, and an injunction that, if the court grants it, and it will, bars Maison Sinclair from ever using the name Vivian Sinclair again. Every label, every door, every dress. Priya from Bergdorf picked up her bag. So did the man from Saks. You do not place fall orders with a brand that might be legally forbidden, within 90 days, from saying its own name. They were gone before Cordelia found the next word. And then Cordelia did the thing I did not expect, the thing I'd braced against and armored myself against and prepared to feel nothing about. She stopped performing. She sat down on the edge of the hotel bed, still holding the complaint, and the glossy fell off her all at once. And what was underneath was just a frightened 70-year-old woman who had spent a decade lying so continuously that she'd forgotten it was lying. I know what I did, she said very quietly. Not to the buyers, not to the room, to me. Vivian was the talent. I was the mouth. When she died, I was so afraid nobody would need the mouth anymore. So I made it mine. I told myself I was protecting it. I wasn't. I stole it. I stole it from you. And then I stood up in front of 200 people and called you a footnote so I wouldn't have to look at what I'd done. She looked at the bracelet on my wrist and her whole face broke. She wore that click, click, click on the machine. I used to think it was annoying. I'd give anything to hear it now. I had prepared for panic. I had prepared for lawyers, for countersuits, for her calling me an estranged, money-grubbing relative in the trade press. I had not prepared for the truth to come out of her, and it undid something in my chest I'd kept latched for 10 years. Here is where I could have ended her. I want that understood. I held every card. The injunction alone would have erased the brand. The $4 million would have taken her house on Blackstone Boulevard, and her Valentino, and her firm on retainer. I could have made Cordelia a synonym for what she was, in every journal that mattered, and she'd earned it, every inch. So Len squeezed my hand. Brendan waited. It was mine to choose. I chose on my terms, only mine. "Here's what happens," I told her, and my voice was my mother's, level and low. "The brand isn't yours. It never was. Maison Sinclair belongs to me. I own 66% of it as of yesterday, in case your bookkeeper hasn't told you. You'll keep your 34%, and a title, and a salary, because throwing you in the street doesn't bring my mother back, and she'd have hated it. But you will never again speak for her. Every campaign, every interview, every word about who Vivian Sinclair was comes from me now. You called me a footnote in front of 200 people, so the correction will be public too. You'll issue one statement, one, telling the truth about who designed those dresses and who owns her name. After that, you'll be quiet, and you'll keep your house, and you'll come to Sunday dinner if I invite you, and you'll come only if I invite you. That's not a punishment, that's a boundary. The difference is, you don't get to argue with it." She wept then, and it was real, and I let her. Mercy that costs you nothing isn't mercy. It's just weakness with better manners. This cost me. I gave it anyway. On my terms, in daylight, with a paper trail. The only kind of forgiveness that can't be stolen back. The statement ran on June 22nd, 2025. The trade press ran it under my mother's real face. The retrospective, it turned out, made a wonderful launch for the real Maison Sinclair, the one I run now, out of the atelier on Westminster Street, where I had the locks changed back to my mother's original keys. 4 sewing machines have become 9. Solène left Brendan's office and runs my licensing now. She's better at it than I ever was. Brendan handles the estate, and finally, at 64, he let me pay a carpenter $80 to fix the stuck bottom drawer of his desk. He almost cried about that, too. We had a small dinner at the atelier the night the injunction was granted. Not the $500 a plate kind, just Solène and Brendan and Mr. Petrakis, 91 now, from the old dry cleaners, and a lasagna and a $14 bottle of wine, and the radio left on low, the way my mother liked it. The porch light out front flickers. I've never fixed it because she never did. Cordelia came to Sunday dinner 3 weeks later. I invited her. She sat quietly, and she was kind to Solène, and she was smaller and truer than I'd ever seen her. And when the plates were cleared, she asked if she could do one thing. I said yes. She took my mother's silver charm bracelet, the thimble, the scissors, the little worn-thin house, off the table where I'd set it, and with hands that only shook a little, she worked the old clasp onto my wrist, the way my mother had 10 years before, and she said, "There, it was always yours." The name and the woman and everything after her. And she got the clasp closed, and she pressed my hand flat over the 3 warm charms, and she didn't say another word.